Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about Git branches and epics. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, do you think it's a good idea to have Git branches for epics? So I replied to this subscriber and I said, no, I don't think so. Or rather, I used to have coworkers who had this idea, and in some cases, some of my coworkers still think that this is a good idea. I personally don't think it's a good idea, and now they don't either, or maybe they do and they just humor me. I don't know, but I get what I want anyway. So hehe. We kind of stopped doing this and started moving towards a more narrow scope as much as possible. We still have story branches where, well, you have the master branch and you fork out into or you branch from master, and you grab yourself a story branch which is scoped to the barest minimum, if at all possible. And the reason why we do this is because the more granular you are with your code, the less likely you are to have to deal with conflicts, but even more important, the less likely you are to block other people's work. Let me explain that a bit, because you may not. This is something that for me was very obvious, and I tried to pitch this idea to my coworkers who were more in the school of, well, I'm just gonna have to do everything. So instead of creating 3 stories, I might as well just do them all in one story. And so we had a few incidents where I talked to this developer and I explained because of this problem that we had. And the problem was that my coworker, he started working on a story where he'd made the two most common mistakes, at least I used to make before I realized how bad it is to actually work on big stories at the same time. And the second thing is why I always build the UI before I build the backend. I don't start on both things at the same time. I always try to isolate, like make it really isolated, whatever I do. So we were working on this big deliverable, or rather he was working on this big deliverable. He had been working on this story for, what could it have been? I think 2 weeks, something like that. And it wasn't the thing that factors in here as well was that this was not a story that was isolated to one specific feature. This was a touch all the things type of thing. It was a big refactor of a lot of different models and shuffling around a lot of different modules and code and services and so forth, in just restructuring a lot of stuff. Now, for the seniors out there, you're gonna kind of go, this. I think you know where I'm going with this. So when he tried to merge that, he hadn't been able to work on one isolated part, which means that for 2 weeks there have been people who have added new code, changed features, and done a lot of stuff that is relevant to the thing that he's doing. It's in conflict to what he's doing. So he basically had to reverse engineer what they had done and had to spend, I think it took him 3 days total to finally, because he even while he's trying to fix the merge conflicts and try to figure and get a hold of all the people who have changed the code to just figure out, should this be included in the stuff that I have moved, or should it be removed, or like what's going to happen here. He has to talk to a bunch of people to do this, right? Well, during that time, of course, people are still committing code, so he has to do the whole thing over again. So he might talk to developer A and then get done there and then go to developer B, and by the time he's done with the developer B, developer A needs to come back and talk to him again because the developer A has already merged the next thing. And this continued for those 3 days. And after this incident, we sat down and I talked to him and I said, you see, the reason why I promote that you keep your stories as small as possible and that you try to isolate pieces that are useful is that, number one, it is less likely that you will have someone touching that code. And number two, if you are working on something, because this was the case, where you have so much different stuff going on in the same thing, you're touching different concepts, well, you might actually be in a situation where some part of the thing that you're doing is actually relevant code for another story. Now, This is something that was going on while he was doing the major refactor. Many times we had this incident where, well, we would just have to we had to like merge from his branch in order to be, and like it became this weird thing because there were certain models that we needed that he had made in his story, but he wasn't ready to merge them into master, so we couldn't start on a fresh branch. We needed to take that code from his branch and then kind of keep that other branch alive until he could merge his branch, because it would be a real clusterfluff if we merged before he merged the branch that we were using. So it became this really nested kind of horror show where he was basically blocking work for other developers who were depending on specific parts of his big monster epic, right? So after that, we came into agreement and said, okay, let's try to split down the stories to the smallest sane level. It's not about, as I explained, it's not about being weird and saying that, oh, well, we're going to create a story for, I don't know, adding the URL to a new endpoint. And that's the whole story, because it's not gonna produce any value to just add the URL if it's not gonna do anything. So maybe the story should be, well, implement the front-end code or something like that, or implement the back-end code, because that was another factor that we had as an issue where this developer had started working on, he was halfway finished on the server and halfway finished on the front end. He was working on both at the same time, which was a different sort of problem, because as I said, it just delays the amount. Then he has twice the amount of stuff to get done. If he had just isolated himself on working on the front end first, he wouldn't have had to keep the changes on the back end updated as long as if he had started on just the front end, because then once again, that's a scoping thing, because you have an unfinished system that's not producing any value, but you're changing code in two places where the likelihood of people actually changing that code under you is higher. So after that whole thing, we actually found, at least he came back to me after a while and said that he found that this was, right, it was a bit unusual for his work style, but overall he felt that this was a huge improvement, because now he actually realized that, well, if my coworkers come in and say, hey dude, you need to merge your stuff because I need that code that you're working on, then he could do that like without risk, because he had learned how to isolate the code and like think strategically about what the code he's working on, and he had learned how to scope his stories to be as small as makes sense, so that it was almost risk-free every time to just merge the part of that into the code base and then continue working if there was additional work to be done. So what I want you to take away from this is that, at least from my perspective, I think that having epic branches is not a good idea. I think that you should have story branches where you try to isolate a feature or a part of the story. If you have a really big story, don't like work on the whole thing at the same time. Try to figure out what is the minimum useful thing that I can build, and just do that. Because the thing is, guys, there's virtually no overhead. Like as I told my coworker, if you have a big epic and you can slice that down to 3 stories instead of having one big one, well, what you actually have done, if you can isolate it, is that you have now created a situation where more people can work on this in parallel, because if you have one epic and one person works on that, that's the only person that can work on that feature, basically. And if you want to speed the whole thing up and get some help, well, if you have 3 stories and they're isolated, well, then you can pick up, then someone else can help you out. But you can't if you have the whole thing to yourself. And at the same time, that means that you're going to slow down potentially other people. And if you're touching a lot of stuff, you are going to have a hell of a time trying to merge that back into master. So try to keep things isolated as small as possible, and try to put yourself in a situation where the risk of somebody else touching your code while you're dealing with it is as low as possible. So merge often, and do that frequently, as opposed to waiting for too long and then having to deal with the mess of actually dealing with all these conflicts and so forth. That's at least what I believe, and it's working extremely well for me and my team. Have a great day.